So we're now on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, and we're trying to explain why Reb Chia, in his version of the Mishnah, omits the Okizayis Ashirayim, is Bekmitza Nami Lechol Shirayim Lotani Okizayis, meaning Reb Chia in the Sefer of our Mishnah could not tolerate the words okizayis, and therefore, to maintain the symmetry, he took out the words okizayis even in the ratio. Now, why is it that in the Sefer he couldn't accept okizayis? And the answer is because it would mean that although the shirayim are chaser, but there's still a kezayis worth left to the, if you had the text of our Mishnah, to the shirayim. Now, we have two dimensions in the avodah. We have the komets, and we have the other avodos. With regard to komets, you can't tell me that it was chaser, but there was still a kizayis in the komets, because the komets has to be sholem, it has to be mullet. So the words o kizayis would be meaningless with regard to the komets. And therefore, since B'kmitza Nami Lechol Shirayim Lotani Okizayis, right, with regard to the Kmitza case, which is the ratio, it would be impossible to add Kizayis, because once there's any chisaron in the mincha at the time of the komets, the komets is not effective and the whole carbon is possible. So already, Reb Chia says, to maintain the symmetry, he didn't mention okizayis with regard to the other avodos, and he completely leaves it out. Uktani Sefer, now says Rav, I have my raya, pigul v'chayoven oleha kares, meaning the Aktara will generate a chiyuv or a chaloshem pigul with a chiyuv kares. It means that the Haktorah is mahanyuli. The Haktorah is meaningful to create pigul. Now, why is that so? Because he still has a kizayis worth. So again, if it was chaser and he had only kizayis worth at the time of the kmitza, then there would be no machshavas psul or pigul shayach, because immediately when at the time of the kmitza the carbon is chaser, it's completely invalid. But not so in the case where there was a full amount of the mincha at the time of the kmitza, then it became chaser before the Aktara. Now the Aktara could be meaningful with regard to the shirayim, even though what's left of the shirayim is only a kizayis. Because Rava's understanding of Reb Chia implies or entails that the Haktorah and all the machshavas that he has at the time of the Haktorah are meaningful, and they register simply because within the Azara he has some shirayim left, only a kizayis. And therefore, Ktani Sefer Pigul v'chayovin oleh kares alma mahanyalu Aktara. The Aktara itself is still valid, in this case, to generate a chiyuv kares for Pigul, if he has in mind chutz lizmano. And not only that, we could add that the Haktorah will now remove the Iser Me'ilah. And all this is meaningful and effective, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, because he still has a kizayis worth of shirai within the Azar again. So where does Rabbi Eliezer say that the avoda is not capable neither of generating pigul nor being matir me'ilah? That's only in the case of yotze, because yotze means that the karba was removed chutz la'azar. But in the case of chaser, where the remnants of the haktorah are still within the azara, says Rova, there the haktorah could be meaningful and valid in the sense that it generates pigul and a chiv kars, and it removes me'ilah. Amalei Abai says lo. Abai says you have no proof from Rabbi Chia's version of our Mishnah. Why? Because Hamani Rabbi Elazar. Again, let's be careful. Not Rabbi Eliezer, but Rabbi Elazar. Okay, now what is Rabbi Elazar? One second. What's Rabbi Elazar? So Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that the Aktaras HaKometz is an all or nothing operation, and you have to be mocked to the entire Kometz. Disnan HaKometz v'halavono v'aktores u'minchas kohanim u'minchas kohen Moshiach u'minchas nesachim shekriv me'achas me'em kizayis b'chutz chayav Rabbi Elazar poter sheyakriv es kulo. So therefore, according to Rabbi Elazar, any kind of burning of the komets does not register unless he burnt the entire komets. And in these cases, where Rabbi Elazar is the dissenting view against the Chachamim of the Mishnah, the Haktorah was only on a Kizayas. And Rabbi Elazar holds you can't be Chayav Haktorah unless the entire komets was burnt. Achiyakriv es kulo. Let's just see if he adds anything here. He says that according to Rabbi Elazar, burning only a kizayis worth of the carbon on the mizbeach is not considered haktorah. So therefore, he says if one burns a kizayis worth outside of the azara, which is called chutz, he's not liable to punishment. Why? Because there's no valid haktorah. Haktorah can only be valid if he does the haktorah not on a kizayis alone, but on the entire amount. So the Gemara continues now and says, "Kevan devaktoras kmitza lo masni le o kizayis mikumtza bachutz." So now Abaye calculates why Reb Chia leaves out kizayis, because the Mishnah reflects the Shita Rabbi Elazar, and therefore, when he's mocked to the komets, you can't say that we're talking about a machshava mefageles if all that's left is a kizayis, because the haktorah, according to Rabbi Elazar, has to be on the entire amount, not just on the kizayis' worth of the komets. Is therefore b'shirayim nami lo masli le o kizayis. Same thing in the case of shirayim, where we said that when he does the Torah with the machshav of chutzim zman of chutzim komo, it's either meaningful or not meaningful. We're going to say that in a case of kizayis, it's not going to be meaningful. So how can the Mishnah add the words o kizayis? the Gemara now rejects Abai. It says, E Rabbi Lazar is high lahakter kum. So what about the levana? Because Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that the same condition and limitation that applies to the kometz itself, the flour, applies equally to the levana, High lahakter kumtza. Why then does the Mishnah speak about lahakter kumtza? It should say lahakter kumtza ulevonasa miboile. It should have added levana. This now we learned in the Mishnah hakometz valevona shehikriv es echad mehem bachutz chayv Rabbi Lazar poter. Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that this halacha, this limitation, that you're only chayav if it was the entire volume, applies even to the levana. So in each case, he needs to be makiv the whole thing. So Gemara says, no, lo nitzchel kometz minchas chote, because minchas chote has no levana. And if it has no levana, then Rabbi Lazar's shita Yaakov kula with regard to levona is inapplicable in a minchas chote, and therefore Rabbi Lazar would have to concede that if he has a machshava to burn, to be makter the kometz chutz lizmano, it generates pigul. He didn't have a machshava on the levona. The answer is there is no levona because the minchas chote has no levona. So Gemara doesn't like this whole approach. I mean, this whole discussion in the Tana was only to tell you about a minchas chote. I mean, what about all the other menachos? And the Gemara is not bothered by this. But ki also of Dimi Omer Blazar kometz the minchas chote, who the Bryce is talking about kometz the minchas chote. Rabbi Lazar. Hadam Rava, now Rava rescinds his original interpretation. Lav milsi the Amri, whatever I said, forget about it. And I cannot recognize the impact of a haktara of the kometz in the case where there's only a kazais left over. This sanya because I have it a brisa. Kodesh kadoshim hu. Shem nifris. Okay, now we're going into a discussion about the lechem aponim, which is described by the Torah's Kodesh Kadoshim. Shem nifris ha'achas mehen chaloseh kulab psulos. It's an all or nothing proposition, and therefore, if any of the lechamim became incomplete, they're all invalid. Hayatzas. Right, we're only talking about nifrisa, but if it was yatzas and one of the various lechamim went out of the azara, then hani deika gavoik sheros, then we'll just replace the one that went out of the azara, which is possible, with a new lechem. But anything else on the shulchan that was left is kosher. Man shamet leiti omer zrika mo elis liyotze, and therefore we have a parallel in Zvachim, that even though it went out of the Azor, but nevertheless the Zrika is meaningful. And again, Zrika in Kodshim is going to parallel the Haktorah of the Levona in the case of the Lechem Aponim. And again, even though in our original case the Lechem Aponim, part of Lechem Aponim went out of the Azara, so too, if part of the Karban went out of the Azara, Rabbi Kiva, that's Rabbi Kiva who holds that you can have an effective Haktorah even if it's Yotze, Uka'omar Nifras Alo. But if one of the Lechamim was completely broken, then even Rabbi Kiva would agree that the Haktorah is not meaningful, and therefore the Gemara holds that in the case of a mincha, Rabbi Akiva would say that you cannot burn the kometz of a mincha to have any effect if it's chaser. Amalei Abai miktani ha yatos, dilma ha nitmes, hanoch ksheros, my time in the Maratzin sits. Maybe the only reason why, if the lechem went out, you can still be maktir the levona is only because it became tameh. And if it became tameh, then we have halacha that it sits on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol is matir tuma. Avli yotzis lo, but in Elchinami, the carbon would be totally possible if it went out of the azara. There, the tzitz doesn't help any. V'abalozahi, the yomer ein zrika moelis liyotze. Ubedinu di boile misli nami yotzas v'haydek tani nifrisa hakamashmalan dafilu nifrisa. Even if one of the loaves became broken to isei bifnim, right? It's still inside the azara. Lo mehanyule aktara. Therefore, the aktara silvona is not effective. Aval Rabbi Akiva di Amar Zrika Moelis Liyotze Afil Chisar Nami Mahanyule Aktara. And we go back to Rava's understanding. Okay, then this is where we'll stop for today with the Mishnah on Daf Yud Beis Amid Beis. Thank you so much. Okay, we're starting the Mishnah now on Daf Yud Beis Amid Beis. Lechol kechatzi zayis ulahakter kechatzi zayis. If he had a machshava poseles to eat half a kazayis, to be makter on the mizbeach a half a kazayis, chutz lizmano, and now the question is whether these two machshavos will integrate to form one machshava poseles kosher. No. She'ein achil v'aktor mitztarfin. We don't integrate a machshava on achilas adam with a machshava on achilas mizbeach. Taima delechol lahaktir. The reason why this carbon remains kosher and the machshava doesn't register a psul is because it was lechol ulahaktir, and we said that there's no combination of achila and aktora. Halechol v'lechol davar she'ein darkol lechol. But what about if he has a case where he's going to eat half? His intention was to eat half a kazayis of the shiraim that's roy lachila, and to eat half a kazayis of something that's not roy lachila. For example, the komets, right, is mitztarif. Then the two machshavos, the kavanos, would integrate to form a machshava posel, so the minch would be psula, vaktani reisha, but yet that seems to contradict the previous Mishnah, in the end of the previous Mishnah, that says lechol dovish darko lechol aktir dovish darko lahaktir, which means that the carbon is possible if he has these combinations of two machshavos that include darko lechol and darko and ein darko lechol. So the beginning of the Mishnah, meaning again the Sefer of the Friedrich Mishnah, taught us that if he does the kmitza, he puts the komets into a kli, conveys it over to the mizbeach, and then bismakter on the mizbeach with the intention to eat something that is meant to eat chutz l'mkomo. And let's be medayik in the language of the Mishnah that davar shedarko lechol in, right? When is the carbon possible, the minchas psul, because it was a davar shedarko, but ain't darko lechol lo. That if he has a machshav of ain't darko lechol, then not. But yet we would just medayik from our Mishnah here, the later Mishnah, that it would seem that if it was davar shedarko she'ain, that it was darko lechol together with ein darko lechol, we could integrate them and the carbon would be possible. Rabbi Yirmiyah Mantana. So now we assume that the Tana of our Mishnah that validates or gives power to the kavanah to eat something that just one second. So the Gemara is Montana. Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah, Hamani Rabbi Lazar, he the Omer Mechashvin Meachilas Adam Lachilas Mizbeach. So that according to Rabbi Lazar, we could, again, if it was Darko Lecho, we could integrate these two machshavos. Meachilas Mizbeach Chilas Adam in both directions. This now we learned in a Mishnah. This Mishnah is in on Daf Yud Zayin, it says Hakomitz es hamincha lechol davar she'ein darko lechol hakti davar she'ein darko lechol kosher, but Rabbi Lezer posel. So Rabbi Lezer says that the korban is posel. So our Mishnah is going to reflect the shita of Rabbi Lezer. The previous Mishnah is going to reflect the shita of the Tanakama who reject Rabbi Lezer. So the implication of our Mishnah that an intent to eat half an olive's volume of the komets would integrate with a regular intent and it would invalidate and passel the korban. That reflects the shita of Rabbi Loza. But the previous Mishnah, which implies that an intent to eat the komets cannot invalidate a korban, a mincha, that reflects the shita of Tanakama. Abaye Omar afilu temer rabbanon lo temer ha lechol lechol davar shedarko lechol ela ema ha lechol lechol davar shedarko lechol umayka mashmalon ha behedje ketani la lechol kizais bachutz kizais lemochar kizais lemochar kizais bachutz kichatzi zais bachutz kizais lemochar b'chatzi zais mochar b'chatzi posel v'ein bokaris. So it means that we see already from the previous Mishnah that if it's a machshava of chutz lezmano and a machshava of chutz and komo, they combine and they passel the mincha as long as the intentions were to eat something that is normally eaten. Hasulamali. So why do I need a Mishnah to give this the same conclusion, the same implication? Ilechol v'lechol dover shein darko lechol kol mashma limits tarev is mireisha shamet mine ilechol ulahaktir midiyuka dereisha shamet mine tahashta ma lechol v'lechol dover shein darko lechol amit lo mitztarev is lechol haktir mi boy in Lechol haktir itzrich le salkedai kamina hosam hudalo ki urche kachoshiv aval hacha devahai ki urcha kachoshiv vahai ki urcha kamachashiv is ema mitztarif kamashmalan.